Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you or somebody you know would like to come on the show and have a chat with me, feel free to reach out to me on Blue Sky. My handle there is isaacr11.com. You can also find me on Twitter. My handle is isaacr11. Or on Mastodon. My handle there is isaacr11 at fossadon.org. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get right to the guest. We were talking about all sorts of interesting topics, and I looked at the clock like, oh, we got to get started. So let's just get started. So my guest today is Tanmai Gopal. Tanmai, do you want to say hello, introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Hey, Isaac. Great to be here. I'm Tanmai Gopal. I'm the CEO co-founder of Hasura. Um, I'm super excited to be talking about all of the things with you. So let's see.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it too. And one of the things that I think is always interesting when when I'm talking with people, especially people that have a really interesting opinion about tech, like I believe you do, is how it all got started. So, do you recall when tech first introduced itself to you, and kind of what that feeling was like, and when you decided that tech was kind of be your thing?
It happened in a bunch of in stages, I think. Um, when pre university, I uh, using kind of in the 90s, like kind of a PC user, getting familiar with the internet, getting like my first email ID and stuff like that. And kind of just being fascinated by the fact that like we could kind of create an entire virtual world that existed inside a box.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and I kind of wanted to be a part of that. Like, how does this even work? Right? Like,
yeah,
how does this how does this thing work, right? Like
yeah,
all the way from like a hardware level to like being able to create your own virtual system, software game, whatever it is. How does all of it come together? And being kind of fascinated by that. Um, and then kind of getting deep into, like just engineering and engineering
yeah,
prep and stuff like that for a few years. And then in university, when I kind of like when I started studying computer science, and I did my bachelor's and master's in computer science. That's kind of when I really started programming and getting into it. Um, and and then kind of really realizing and understanding where that power comes from and the ability that it has to kind of that agency that you suddenly get and being able to change the
yeah,
world around you is amazing, right? It's unprecedented, the speed with which you can think of a thing and then build a thing, and then that thing actually has impact. And that is like a dream come true, right? It's like it's what all of us really want to do, right? We want to change our selves and our world
yeah,
around us and the larger world around us, right? Like that's like a fundamental human drive. Um, and like computer systems are just amazing at letting you
yeah,
do that. And so in university, I built out this. Um, a bunch of us tried, and there was our first product was to kind of try to build a little Craigslist inside
mm,
inside the university campus because for textbooks and
sure, sure.
and things like that. But that was kind of like the first experiment with just getting into it and understanding what product development feels like and what that potential impact can be.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things it's very prevalent to me when I talk with people, especially people that are founders like you, is this level of curiosity. Have you always been like a really curious person, like outside of tech, like understanding how things work? Like my wife makes fun of me all the time because like we'll be talking about something and then I'll be like, oh, I have to go look this up like immediately, like stop conversation, pause, I'm gonna go look up on the internet like the answer to like some interesting question that I have. Are you similar in that regard where you have this
Yeah.
thirst for knowledge, even though it sounds cliche?
Yeah, it is. I mean, inside out, I didn't know if it was something that was kind of like uh, uh, unique or interesting, but over the years, I realized that it's something that um, I really enjoy doing more than kind of maybe im- than is immediately apparent, right? Like it kind of occasionally even becomes socially awkward, right? Because you're like
Yeah.
you're in a group and people are talking
Yeah.
about something and you're like, no, wait, hold on, I need to
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
like the most important thing right now is to actually research this topic and find out, right? Like you'd be checking something out on a travel trip and you'd be like, nope, I really need to find out the history of this place and how this came to be and why this is like this and why is this like this again? It doesn't feel right. And so that's interesting. But that's how I'm wired. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so and I don't want to like jump too far forward in the conversation, but I'm generally curious because I've noticed kind of a change for me, and I'm fighting it very very hard. Is like typically I'll go to a search engine with a question that I have, right? But I've started to recently being like, oh, maybe just like chat GPT it, like especially if it's a question that like I actually have to probably like
Hmm.
dig a little bit into, and I'll
Hmm.
like quote unquote trust AI to kind of give
Hmm.
me the answer that I'm looking for. Have you started to go down this path where you're like,
Oh, for sure.
I could do a Google search for what's the population density of whatever, right? And
Yep.
have you started to go down this path, or are you kind of like, no, I still kind of like looking at sources and I like learning for myself instead of trusting like some AI that's, if you really think about what AI really is, it's just probability, right? Instead of like
Yep.
reading
Yep.
actual concrete things. Like I'd love to get your thoughts
Yep.
on that.
Yep.
Like, finding
Yeah.
the
No,
answers to
for
our
sure.
questions versus, typical traditional search versus on the AI side.
Yeah. I think personally, I found myself kind of like leaning towards an internet search only now when I know that the information that I'm looking for is like very real time.
Yeah.
Uh, E-commerce, right? Like, hey, I really need to kind of purchase this in the next few days for
Hmm.
this travel thing that I have, and let me like, is this available, right? Can I go pick it up somewhere or whatever? Like that kind of thing is like a very definite. Let me go do like a Google search type thing. Um, but a lot of other things, especially that end up being a little bit more back and forth, more researchy. Um, even if the information is a little bit out of date, I end up kind of just gravitating towards a chat GPT or a Claude or something.
Yeah.
Um, and that's definitely been a behavior shift. And I think it's fascinating to see that across generations, right? Like uh, my father's just completely hooked onto like chat GPT,
Oh,
and
interesting.
he's just like, because he's like this, he keeps like, he's like a sponge that keeps
Yeah.
soaking
Yeah.
knowledge like as much as he can. And so for him it's like a godsend. He's like, oh, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Like this is all I ever wanted since I was like in first
Sure.
grade.
Well,
So it's insane.
yeah, I wonder if that's an interesting thought experiment because I mean, I don't like I think you and I are similar ages or we grew up in the same time where it's like, you know, we were given this gift of an accessible internet at a young
Yep.
age, right? Or
Yep.
young-ish age,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
we've kind of were built on the concepts like you can get any piece of information you want if you know how to
Yep.
look for it. Whereas
Correct.
generations before
Correct.
us, like they either
It
knew it
was
or
it was
they
a whole
didn't
thing.
know it. Yeah, right?
Hmm.
So I could only
Hmm.
imagine, going from, in your father's case, so your father's probably of similar
Right.
age to my parents are, where it's like, okay, I this internet thing, like I don't really fully grasp it. I just know that if you can use search engine, whatever, but you tell me that I can just go into a chat box and type in my question and it gives me my response, similar to like all of the sci-fi things when I was a kid.
Yep. Yep.
Like that makes a
Yep.
lot of sense because
Yep.
you think about TV shows from 40, 50 years ago, and all of them that were futuristic had like this hyper intelligent assistant, right? Every single one of them, whether it was a robot, whether it was just a floating voice or whatever, right? Um, so does your dad or your parents, do they care about how it actually works? Or are they just happy that it works?
I think they're curious about how it works a little bit, but
Yeah.
to kind of like understand the boundaries of like what it can do. But they kind of take it for granted because it's almost like, I mean, it's fairly magical, right? Like you're going from a time from like, you've seen like telegraph systems, right? Where it's like
Sure. Yeah.
Morse code transliterated into like letters, right? With like telegrams that go like, "Hi, stop," like "I
Yeah.
am sick, stop," right? Like
Yeah.
you're going from like that world to phones, to wireless, to PC, to internet, and like, and as if that's not enough, right? Now you have AI. It's just like
Hmm.
magic after
Yeah.
magic after
Yeah.
magic after magic, right? So you kind of, I guess, maybe start taking it for granted. It's like, oh yeah, yeah, this this ought to have worked, and this kind of works. Um, but I think they're really taking to it, right? Which is kind of the hallmark of any good like seismic technology shift that's happening, right? And so I feel so fortunate that we're kind of that we get to live through a time and actually have agency in impacting the world
Yeah.
when there's AI that's happening, right? Like
Yeah.
a few years before this or a few years after this, you would not be in this golden moment where we can be a part of the generation that is actually building, like we're
Yeah.
setting up how the world is going to be with AI. That's awesome. That's amazing.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of things that I immediately think about. Like, for instance, I was taking things for granted. I've said this a few times. I talk about my kids, right? Like my kids, they take internet for granted, like Wi-Fi for granted. Like I was having a conversation with my kid because we just built them a PC, and I was kind of showing them because the whole thing was, "Oh, we're gonna build this together, so we're gonna like buy all the parts and then we're gonna put it together." And they were asking me what different things were, and like the Ethernet port came up, and I was like, "Oh, that's how you plug a cable into to get internet." And my kid is like, "Why do you plug that in to get internet? Like the Wi-Fi is just out." I'm like, "Well, no, you have to understand. Like one, like is Wi-Fi isn't the best internet in a lot of cases. It's the most accessible in a lot of senses, but it's not the best." And we went through this whole conversation, and my kid is just so like not interested in the idea of like, no, I want like, entitled in like this whole like entitled thing. Like I just want to connect my device to the air and it has internet access, right? Same thing with like touch screens. Like they'll go to a screen that's not touch and they'll touch it because they assume it's going to be
Yeah.
touch, right?
Yep.
And it's
Yep.
it's
Yep.
pretty fascinating, right? Like it's
Yep.
and I wonder, you know, my kids are like, they're not teenagers yet, but I'd imagine like in 10 years when they're like becoming coming into adulthood, like the next generation of kids, like how expectant on technology they're going to be because in 10 years, who knows where we're going to be, right? So it's
That's
like one of
true.
those
That's true.
things
But
where
I
it's
think like,
completely fascinating.
yeah, no, exactly to that, right? I feel like, it's like, I think the curve of like progress is exponential, right? Like, so, so I'm sure that for like the generation that was, born after say 2010, um, their kids are like, for them, I feel like the generation like shifts are much faster. It's, you know, they're gonna have kids or they're gonna see the next generation, which is gonna take it for granted that you get like internet in the deep sea, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Or
sure.
imagine like living in a place where like every single square inch of the planet has internet,
Yeah.
wireless internet. That's
Yeah.
insane, right? Like
Yeah.
there isn't a place on the planet where you do not get the internet, and what kind of world would that be? And there's going to be a generation that takes that for granted, not just Wi-Fi for granted, but like you could be in the Amazon rainforest, or you could be like 10 miles under the ocean, or you could be like in near outer space, and you have internet
Yeah.
everywhere, right? And then like maybe 10, 20 years from that, you're interplanetary, and then you have internet. Like it's
Yeah.
crazy, right? It's exponential, I guess. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, I gotta put a bunch of shows on my tablet because I'm going to the moon and the moon's got terrible Wi-Fi, right?
Exactly, right?
Like
Like what you do today for a flight. You're like, let me download some stuff on Netflix because I want to watch stuff on the flight.
oh yeah, no, that's fascinating. I do think like if you like belong in a pocket, a generational pocket where there's a very sudden transition. Like I think of like my generation's big transition was flip phones to the iPhone, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
going from oh wait like all of this like because computers were a thing, but it's like oh now I have a computer in my pocket and I can not
Hmm.
only text and make phone calls, but I can also look at map and I can also
Right.
browse the internet, right? Like that was pretty I remember it vividly like like the first friend that I had that got one and I didn't understand for like a very short amount of time. It's like why do you want all of these things in on your phone? Because I couldn't imagine a
Yep.
world where I needed them. But now like, 15 years
Can't
later
do
it's
without.
like can't live without it.
Yep.
So I wonder what the next generational shift is going to be if it's like if it's this AI pre and post AI moment, if that's what the thing is, right? It'll be interesting to see, if we look back and we're like, oh man, could you imagine like before like ChatGPT came out? Could you imagine living in a world where you couldn't just get a prompt answer to all of your questions that your heart desired?
Yep. I think it's gonna be amazing, right? It's gonna be like this it feels like um I don't know how true this is, but it feels like the end state of all technology is to be as natural or magical
Mm,
as possible, which is
sure.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
like the end state of communication is like telepathy or something, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the end state of communication, right? Like we've been like screwing around with like Morse code to like landlines to wireless to video to whatever to ultimately it's just like head like I can just beam it to your mind and whatever is the like we're getting there, right? And it
Yeah.
feels like with AI, it's going to be absolutely amazing because it's kind of like this is how technology was meant to work. I
Oh, sure.
wasn't supposed to be restricted by this form factor that makes me do things in a particular way, but like my natural way of thinking or doing was supposed to get augmented and amplified. That's what technology was supposed to do for me. And now that's what it does. And that's going to be fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Like that transition of I'm kind of waiting for the first few killer AI apps to come out, right? Which I don't think
Hmm.
is there yet, right? Like
No. No.
we don't have the iPhone of um um like we don't have the first few amazing apps
Yeah.
on the iPhone that made the iPhone, right? Like
Sure. Sure.
we need those I guess the example maybe in the dot-com revolution would have been like e-commerce, right?
Sure.
Like when
Sure.
e-commerce happened and suddenly unlocked the internet, people are like, oh shit, we
Yeah.
can do business on this thing. And it's not just for like people who really just understand Ethernet ports to like, talk to each other on shareware channels or whatever it is, right? But it's actually for doing business that just transformed the world, right? Um, I think those first few transformative like AI applications will come out and then it's going to be crazy, right? Because I think we're still seeing a lot of like AI inside business, inside enterprise,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. But I think like the first few AI consumer apps are they still have to come. And we
Sure.
don't know
Yeah.
what it's
Yeah.
going to look like, right?
Well, it's kind of like a land battle at the moment, right? Where it's like,
Mm,
in order for these businesses to build these really great consumer apps, like the underlying providers of this AI tech, whether it's, big tech companies or, smaller companies are hyper focused on like Anthropic or OpenAI, they have to do the work first. And I was thinking about this the other day about how like, you know, it this wasn't this is one of the first things that I've remembered in my life that I immediately saw it and I was like, "Oh yeah, that's obvious." But the technology wasn't there yet. Like we were talking about,
hmm
like this has been a trope in science fiction for 60 years. It's
hmm
just the technology hasn't been there to get us to this point. And now that it's, we see the first semblances of this, everybody's like, "Oh yeah, like that my show growing up had that, AI assistant thing that followed me around and did the stuff, right?" So
hmm
it's one of those things where it's not even really, and I mean this in the nicest way possible. It's not even innovation. It's delivery on what you think is possible, which I think is pretty fascinating because like the iPhone is innovation completely because nobody even for a second thought that they wanted a computer in their pocket, right?
Yep.
But people have been
Yep.
thinking about like smart assistants for 20 years, right?
Yep.
And before that it
Yep.
was like science fictiony, oh like, in the year 2140 we're going to have these things. So it's actually kind of
Yep.
interesting in that regard that it's like the idea isn't new. It's the tech has finally been able to deliver the idea.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think like I mean it's kind of it's interesting and this is kind of what I see with people that people that I interact with and work with is like um the there's going to be kind of a return to like the first principles of business, right? Which is that um if I was a bank and the most important thing that I did was maintain a ledger,
Sure.
for each individual and a ledger of transaction. That's like the core part of what a bank does, right? One part of what a bank does. Like there's another core bit, which is say loans or whatever. But if this kind of transactional commercial banking is the core of what the bank does, there's so many layers of things that have accumulated on top of that to provide that core value,
Sure.
right? Ultimately, it's just that core value, right? Like you have a bank branch and an ATM machine and then a app, and all of that is just they're just different proxies to that core value of the ledger, and the
Hmm.
ledger being automatically and trust safely being updated. That's really it, right? Everything else is just gravy. Um, and maybe we fast forward to a world now where it returns to that, right? Where like businesses just are the core of what they are, and then there's AI in the mix that just does stuff on top of this,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, go pay my bills for everything
Yeah.
less than $100, just go sell that for me, right? Because, I'll just tell my AI to do things and it'll use those kind of core things that exist in the business,
Yeah.
run operations on them and make it happen. Um, and so there's this drastic simplification that potentially happens for all businesses, while at the same time it gives the ability for anybody it gives anybody the ability to kind of start a new business because now all they need is a core. They need the core of they need the core of what adds business value. And
Yes.
if I can do that on whatever business, then I don't need all these other pieces of infrastructure that I had to invest in and raise money for and capital for to build. I can just do this core thing and let AI systems,
Yeah.
either mine or somebody else's, a third party or whatever it is, take care of the rest, right? Um, and that could be fascinating, right? And it already feels like some steps are kind of being made in that direction.
Yeah, I want to kind of put a hold on the AI conversation for a second because I think there's far more to talk about in this world, but I want to kind of, you know, get to where we are today with kind of your story, right? Like, so so you go to university and you had this, this interest in technology, and I think you pretty realized at a fairly young age that like that's where the money was. That's how you can kind of make a great life for yourself. Um, and I like to ask this question to folks like, do you remember like the first like real problem that you had to solve with technology once you started working?
Um, so I think, I mean, after university, I kind of got into, um, I decided to start my own consulting firm.
Yeah,
Um, and one of the things I wanted to do was kind of explore how technology, because I got a sense of like how much it can do. And then I kind of wanted to see, well, how is it actually being used?
sure.
And what are people doing with it, right? And what's the ability for to kind of impact day-to-day work and stuff like that. And so I started a consulting firm and um, initially closer to my area of research, which was more kind of computer vision machine learning. Um, and then kind of soon realized that like the most people were still not there in
Mm,
those weren't like the most impactful or the kind of problems that needed to be solved. And the problems that kind of needed to be solved uh, were more just not being able to apply software engineering quickly enough to do stuff. Um, and as I kind of got into that space, I remember that first real problem, kind of coming across it in a different shape that ended up becoming Hasura, the company, and our open source project around GraphQL was this kind of observation that I'm just spending so much time getting data from a centralized system
mm,
into the form factor.
yeah.
Um, like
To pause you
it's
for a
all
second,
just yeah.
there's a
Go
whole
ahead, go ahead.
segment of tech whose job it is to do data transformation.
Yep.
Like like but continue your thought. Like that's what I think is wild is like we've gotten to this point where every service, even ones you create yourself, they all have different form factors for output of how they store their data. And that is exhausting when it comes to like, oh, we need to put in a centralized source. But I sorry to interrupt you. Keep going with your thought.
No, no, that's exactly it, right? Like it's like and it's not just in tech, right? I also felt like there's so much um there's so much kind of engineering like talent and people. um we spent so much time in building these pieces of software that essentially just move data from one place to another, right?
Yeah.
It's not kind of the core data or the core business logic of the business. It's not kind of the part that makes that available as the face of the product to the end user. It's this there's so much like crap in the middle,
Yeah.
right? That's required to make this happen. And then we kind of started experimenting and playing around a lot with what it would mean to automate that or take that away, and and we spent a lot of time there. And what that resulted in was this slightly crazy idea, which was to say, it seems like all the APIs that we build are um, essentially just authorization logic
Mm,
on top of um, core data, right?
interesting.
Like you
Yeah.
look at the CRUD, you look at the business logic of CRUD. It's like there's a lot of shaping, reshaping, transformation kind of stuff,
Yeah.
right? Which is like, oh, the database speaks SQL or no SQL or whatever, and my app speaks JSON, right? Like that's kind of like
Sure.
this
Yeah.
this what technology they speak. But a lot of the business value that is being added in kind of these layers of APIs and things that people build to connect applications to data is essentially just authorization logic. Validate what goes in,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, ensure that what comes out is right. And that's pretty much it. Like,
Yeah.
that's really just it, right? So, if we had a system that could capture that modeling of core data, and if we had a system that could absorb these authorization policies and rules, then we could just like automate the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then
I mean,
why should anybody build this, right?
that
Makes
makes
kind of sense, right? And
yeah, it's like it's so to the point where it's like it's kind of makes you feel stupid for like yeah, stupid's probably not the right word, but it's like you're like, of course that makes sense because
yeah, it's a
like
kind of obvious in hindsight kind of
in
thing,
yes,
right?
exactly, exactly.
And so we built like the first version of like what would become GraphQL engine, and we started using it in these consulting projects, and we realized like, hey, this is just super fast. Like this makes us super productive. We can like help people build stuff with this really quickly. And that kind of led to saying, uh, we think this has legs. And then we raised money, we started a startup, and we kind of used those ideas and built like GraphQL engine, which we then kind of open sourced and became an open source project. So that was kind
Hmm.
of the genesis of that piece. Um, and and um, and and we had no idea how big this problem was. We thought it
Sure.
was a big problem from like the 80, 90 like clients and customers that we'd worked with at that time. Um, and then we started like, then when we gave it to developers and we said, hey, folks, can take this and build stuff with it and let's see, right? And people kind of start building all kinds of applications, people in like one person startups to gigantic like Fortune 5, Fortune 10 companies started using it and building mission critical applications with it. And then we kind of started to realize like the depth and the breadth of this kind of data access issue. And like it's not just a technology problem, it's an organizational problem, it's a time problem, it's a legacy problem. It's like you'd
Hmm.
made investments 10 years ago, you want to now use the latest stuff, but you can't. And like this, it's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and that kind of started to help inform and help our business kind of grow, right? Which was amazing to see uh, how that kind of like critical first principles problem
Sure. Yeah.
uh, turned out to be like and it's turning out to be a pretty massive problem, right, for the entire industry.
Yeah. I mean, you said a lot of things there, and I think one thing that I'm interested in this world, like we're talking a lot about GraphQL, right? Like this
Hmm.
idea that
Hmm.
you can write a query on
Hmm.
top of, when you like instead of writing it in SQL or some other proprietary language that the database knows, like you send it across the wire with your request, and then that stuff is
Hmm.
done for you, so instead of you having to do that filtering in app or whatever, right? Um, and I'm curious about this next thing, because when I think of GraphQL, I think of like the next iteration of GraphQL, and this is complete an incorrect take. But from an
Mhm,
end user
mhm,
standpoint, is like the low code promise,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
Where it's like, okay, I'm
mhm,
just like UI pointed at data source. Like you said, the authorization stuff is handled for me. I
mhm,
can maybe
mhm,
do like some WYSIWYG, like filtering and
mhm,
sorting, and then I have an app.
mhm,
I'd love to
mhm,
get your thoughts about that
mhm.
entire space. Because one of the things that
Yeah, yeah.
I think of as a developer, I'm like, it'll never work.
Mhm,
Low code will never work. You know why?
mhm,
Because it requires a developer to do something, and only I,
mhm,
because I'm a developer and I'm a very special
mhm,
snowflake, like
mhm,
heaven forbid, like
mhm,
a business worker can do that thing that I can probably do.
mhm, mhm,
So I'd love to
mhm.
get your
Yeah,
thoughts
that's a
on
very
that.
good. No, that's a really good point, right? It's a question that we've thought about, the topic that we've thought about a lot, right? So I think like um, and this is our kind of take on low code, right? Um, there's a segment of kind of business logic
Hmm.
that which is code that we write today that can entirely disappear. Um,
Okay.
and this piece is the piece where you kind of buy into the realization that wait, databases have become really powerful,
Yeah.
right? You're if you let go of the idea that I have to model my entire domain in code, and you say that, well, databases are so powerful, let me just model my domain in the database. Like I don't want to create a user class in Python.
Hmm.
That's an implementation detail. I
Yep.
actually have a user model in my database. And my user model in the database, maybe it's backed by three other data models actually, but I have a view of it or whatever, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But as close to it as possible, I try to keep my domain model to be as close to the models that are being exposed in a way from my underlying data systems. And this only happens when you kind of switch your way of thinking to saying, I want to leverage the database's power and what the database is good at. And this, I think, only started happening a few years ago. Like this was not possible 20 years ago when you were going through kind of rapid scaling because databases were not good enough. The database industry at that time had kind of like stagnated, right? Um, and refused to kind of innovate for that crazy web
Sure.
scaling world.
Sure.
So a lot of people start building a lot of like that data handling logic, scaling logic at the application layer, right? So like, is Facebook's database MySQL? Yes, but also absolutely no, it's not MySQL,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's a fleet of hundreds of thousands of MySQL database instances that are virtualized over, and they have their own data layer called Tau, right? So, so when we realize that the database technology has now gotten so mature that databases can do what they were originally meant to do, model our domain well, then you kind of realize that there's a class of work that you're doing that you don't need to do,
Mm.
that you ought to be letting the database do that. And you ought to be having a layer in the middle that is kind of interfacing with your database that uh, allows you to evolve the database easily and secure it and protect it and whatnot. But that layer ought to be as thin as possible.
Yeah.
So that layer is now a layer where you can like fundamentally have low code, no code,
Hmm.
right? But it depends deeply on a choice of making sure that you're modernizing your data layer, right? Like you can't do this on like 20-year-old version of SQL Server or Oracle or whatever, right? But you can have this way of thinking with a modern Postgres, a
Well,
modern
you
Mongo, a modern
well you
ClickHouse.
can you can, but you need to build something in the middle. And this is what we're
Exactly.
we're we're trying to not like
Not do.
basically turn data into some transformed like uh easily identifiable schema, right?
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
Right, and kind of that's like the place where I think like low code no code uh can fundamentally just disappear, right? Like you look at the OLAP, the analytics ecosystem. That ecosystem has kind of leapfrogged this idea, right? There the idea is that no, I'm going to use my Snowflake, Databricks, BigQuery, DuckDB, whatever, and I'm
Hmm.
going to put as much logic close to the data layer as possible.
Yeah.
I'm going to think about my data layer very deeply, right?
Yeah.
But over the last 10 years, as engineers, we like there's this aversion to thinking about the data layer, right? We're like, no, 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 I'm a
Oh,
Golang
sure.
expert or a
Yeah.
JavaScript expert or a
Yeah, yeah,
Python
yeah.
expert.
Yeah, yeah.
But what you really ought to be is a Postgres expert, a ClickHouse expert, a Mongo expert, so that when you realize that 80% of my work is choosing the right data layer to get my job done,
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
like that's the problem solved, right? You're like, ah, wait, this is like time series stuff with a lot of real time stuff. I should chuck this into ClickHouse, and this is kind of transactional, whatever. I think I can just go with Postgres. This should be fine. Oh no, this is a bit where I need like this is going to be like data is going to come in from everywhere. Um, it's super critical. It needs to be highly available all the time. I need multi-master stuff that works like seamlessly. I'm going to put this stuff into like the latest generation Mongo, whatever, right?
Sure, sure.
When you as a backend engineer or as an engineer start thinking about that problem more than
Mhm.
thinking about how do I build all of that functionality in code
Yeah.
against a database that I refuse to acknowledge, that's kind of when you realize that low code no code doesn't work for you, because then you try to use a low code no code framework and then you're like, nope, I still need to do all the work here,
Well,
right?
sure. I
It's not
mean,
flexible enough. How can anybody automate this?
I haven't been in tech forever, but I've been in tech enough to know that like, you talk to the DBAs, you talk to a DBA, and they'll tell you like when it leaves my server, it needs to be basically exactly how you want it.
Yeah,
Otherwise, you're gonna have performance issues, right? That's
exactly.
why there was a point in time
Exactly.
where like, and I don't know if you ever dealt with this, but there's like stored procedures. Like a
Exactly.
database would have 1,000 stored procedures because it was much
Correct.
easier than like trying to
Correct.
write the queries in whatever a particular way. So it's
Correct.
like, okay,
Correct.
this app always needs the data to come back
Yep.
this way. Just hit a sprock
Yep.
and be good with it.
Yep.
Right. Like that's
Correct.
very much like in the
Correct.
relational world where you like, the Oracle
Yep.
SQL world,
Yep.
right? In
Yep.
Mongo
Yep.
and in other
Yep.
more NoDB offerings, like that's not as
Yep.
easily. Like functions are cool,
Correct.
but like functions don't do the exact same thing that
They're not the
sparks
same
do.
thing
Yeah.
exactly, right? And
Yeah.
so what we kind of did at Hasura was kind of provide a different kind of abstraction to say it's closer to the DBA, but as if it was brought into like modern programming, right? So you
Yeah.
you kind of have these core data and core methods, and core methods can be written in whatever language you want, however flexible you want, and you have this core data where you're getting default CRUD kind of semantics. You're able to read write with that data easily,
Hmm.
and that's kind of in the database of your choice, in a modern database that does a lot of heavy lifting for you, right? And I think when we think about it from that point of view, there are like significant returns to a low code, no code investment, right? Like our
Yeah.
biggest customers, like five of the Fortune 10 are customers, right? And they have mission critical applications deployed. And and those teams have seen a very high ROI when they kind of start to think this way, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so that's kind of one take on low code, no code, right? And then I think like in the post AI world, I think we've leapfrogged this entire conversation.
Yeah.
I feel like the low code, no code conversation is just a very it's like a very different
Yeah.
conversation now, right?
Yeah.
And I don't even think we fully understand it yet. I have a few hypotheses, but like post AI, the whole low code, no code thing is something else altogether.
Yeah, and I think and I apologize. I think we got right into talking about what Hasura does without like kind of doing like I would love for the folks that are listening that might not know about Hasura, like just give me like the elevator pitch and your initial idea for this as a company and what problem you believe it solves. Let's do that and then get into some AI stuff because I think that's the most important next step.
Yeah. So kind of like similar to what we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
Hasura's core open source project, our flagship open source project, on top of which we have an enterprise offering
Yep.
for people who are running it in mission critical environments at scale. Um, is this core idea of saying, what if we can get away from having to build data APIs
Hmm.
to provisioning data APIs, right? Like, what if it's like the way that you provision a database, you provision your APIs, right? You just kind of go in, you do a bunch of CI/CD stuff, and like APIs just exist. And then
Yep.
you don't implement those APIs, you still implement core data and core business logic. You think about the modeling, you think about like what the transaction logic is, and it's complicated and whatnot. And you do that, and insta magically, like the APIs just work. They're
Yeah.
stable, they don't break, right? Like they handle authorization for you. That's kind of the core idea, and that's been like immensely impactful to hundreds of thousands of developers. in all kinds of organizations, and that's kind of what we built the business on, right? This idea of making data accessible to products, to teams, to developers by provisioning APIs instead of having to go through like a 2 week sprint or a 1 quarter like development life cycle where you build and design APIs. You just get a really high quality standardized API once you do the actual hard work of data modeling and business logic, right? You do that hard work, you get the APIs. So that's kind of what Hasura does. And now in this next phase, we're starting to kind of bring and understand what this idea means when you don't have products and developers that communicate with data over APIs, but you have AI applications or you have humans using AI applications to interact with that data.
Hmm.
What does it mean? Like is what is what is the API for AI? What is the data API for AI? What right? Like it has to change. What is it? What does it mean? I think that's kind of where uh, all of the excitement is and where the next phase of our growth is, and we're seeing like some very, very interesting things.
Yeah, I'm gonna put my marketing hat on and I'm gonna summarize what you just said far more eloquently than I could. Um, and if I say anything that's incorrect, please correct me. But I think one of the things that you folks are providing is the next generation of the promise of GraphQL,
Correct.
right? Like GraphQL very much, I think most developers, if they haven't used it, they have a pretty, they have a knowledge of it and the value that it provides. However, like unless you put a lot of effort into it, like GraphQL
Yep.
is it doesn't give you doesn't fully deliver on that promise that we've been talking about. Like getting your,
Exactly.
efficient response for requests against data, right? And I think one of the things that's fascinating about this entire space is that, like, and I'm not trying to not GraphQL, but I think one of the things that GraphQL does really well is also kind of one of its downfalls is that it
Yep.
almost makes it too simplistic to do
Hmm.
like very complicated things. So we were
Yep.
talking about like back engine engineering, right? Like I've had
Yep.
conversations with plenty of developers that don't know anything about databases, but they
Yep.
know GraphQL, and that
Yep.
to me is very scary. Not to say that I'm
Hmm.
a database expert, but like you need to
Correct.
understand like how these, like
Correct.
if it's a relational versus a non-relational model, the
Correct.
execution path
Correct.
of that stuff. But like
Yep.
GraphQL is just
Yep.
like, nope, just a query against your database, right? And I think that to me is mildly terrifying. So like I'd love to get your thoughts on that because I think
Yeah.
that,
No, and I think that's
yeah.
that's the that's at a technical level, that's exactly the value that we add, right? Which is to
Hmm.
say, hey, if you want an amazing API, and GraphQL is a really nice API that is flexible, that lets you do whatever that you want to do, but have it work in a way that like is sane, right? It's hard to do. And that's
Yeah.
the magic that we make possible, right?
Yeah.
And the technical implementation of that is fairly sophisticated. I think we're one of the largest Haskell code bases in the world. Um, it's essentially like a runtime compiler,
Hmm.
and like a just-in-time with transpiler is more accurate. What it's doing is it's kind of taking in these GraphQL queries that come in, and it's not like mapping them to these like converting them into SQL calls, right? It's or like NoSQL. It's actually compiling them into a kind of query that is optimized for that underlying data source. So if you were to make a GraphQL query that was hitting Postgres, we would compile that into a single Postgres query that had JSON aggregations and stuff in it. But if you're hitting MySQL, it's better to hit that same database multiple times. That's the way the database works. If you're hitting Mongo, then we convert that into an aggregation pipeline, which is which is the right and efficient way of querying Mongo that we hit Mongo with. So that transpiler kind of takes care of like these very different query compilation patterns, which kind of represents uh, the knowledge that a database expert would have had if they had all the time in the world to create
Yeah.
a perfect database query that would have mapped to that kind of flexible GraphQL query that you're creating, right? This is impossible work to do if you're in charge of building an API endpoint, right? Like you do not want to put in that much effort when you don't even know what the value of this API endpoint is going to be, right? Um, and I think that's kind of very central to the technical value that Hasura provides.
I'm curious that, and I don't want to get into like a religious war about languages, but I'm curious as to like what was it about Haskell that interested you, so like you mentioned that it's probably one of the largest code, like Hasura is like one of the largest code bases for Haskell. Like, is there a specific thing around Haskell from, like, obviously you probably wanted a functional language, right?
Yep.
But like, what was it about Haskell specifically that gave you what you want, or is it just like we had enough people that were knowledge in it, it was flexible enough to do what we wanted, so let's move forward.
Yeah, I kind of a bit of both, but also like to build like Haskell is a language that's really good for writing compilers in,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
it's surprisingly high performance. Like it's surprisingly good on concurrency and just execution speed because it like compiles down like all the way to like machine code.
Yep.
Um, and that makes it like fast. So
Hmm.
so it turned out to be like a really, really good
Yeah.
language to build this kind of a system with. Um, Also because of its focus on correctness, it meant that because we're such a critical piece of the stack, just the number of bugs and security issues that we have can like shut the company down, right? Like
Mm.
you make a bad change to the software and somebody's API starts returning different data, or like has a security issue or a data integrity
Yeah.
issue, you're screwed.
Yeah.
And so it allowed us to iterate really quickly on a very kind of critical and complicated piece of software. And that I think was where we kind of really found the groove with Haskell. As we kind of now move to the AI side of it and whatnot, that best choice now net out to be Rust for us. And
Mm.
so
Yep.
now that system is there's a lot of Rust in the system.
Yep.
That's the choice that we make kind of
Yeah,
today. But
sure.
like 5 years ago, that um, early engineers, including myself, were familiar with Haskell, and Haskell was just like a
Yeah, no one is
phenomenally fast language to
I'm
prototype in
yeah,
and get work done,
I'm not
which
here
is
to knock your choice to build something in functional with that's not Erlang. I'm not going down that world, right? Like, I mean, for what it's worth, like, I think that every language serves a purpose in certain scenarios that others don't, right? Like, you wouldn't have written this thing in C++. Like, you could have, but you would have hated yourself, right? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. But it's
but
also I think like with a startup and a business, it's always also more of like what do you and your team know, right? So if like the only language we knew was PHP and the problem was critical enough, we would have done it in PHP. It doesn't matter, right? Like you can build whatever and whatever, and it and just honestly boils down more to like what your team know and what you can hire for and what you can build the team for. That ends up being like far more important than anything else, right? Once that's there, and then you have a choice set, then you can make the choice within that choice set. But I feel like that lays more constraints than the language itself.
yeah, no, this whole area of like my language is the best language and your language sucks is kind of is fun, but like I don't subscribe to any of it. I do want to finish the conversation around, we've been talking about AI for a large amount of it, and then we kind of talked about Hasura a little bit. Like, let's talk about combining those two efforts, right? Like, obviously, we were talking about this before we got started. Like, I think one of the first or second things that I did with ChatGPT was like, hey, write this SQL query that's very complicated. Because, I mean, again, I can write some interesting SQL queries, but they're not going to be very efficient, right? And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts as to like how AI can help enable like this whole data access problem that a lot of people have.
Yeah, no, that's and that's kind of what we've been thinking about, imagining kind of like the end state of this is just that um as a user who is maybe you're inside an organization, you're in the business team, you're in the operations team, like you're doing work, you're meeting clients, you're like running a warehouse, you're running ops essentially, right? You're doing business things. Or maybe you're an external consumer of a tech product, right? Like a SaaS product, like you consume you're consuming Salesforce, or you're consuming a Zendesk or something. In all of these situations, the end state is to say, or one of the most efficient ways to do this is hypothetically to say, if I had AI that could just, in a trustworthy way, do stuff on my data, that would be amazing. If I can get a chat GPT or a Claude, but that's magically connected to my real-time data and to the real-time systems in the world, that would be amazing. And it worked, right? If it was trustworthy and it worked, that would just be absolutely amazing. If I could go into chat GPT and say, like, hey, what was that thing, that like really nice salad that I had last week?
Yeah, sure,
And can you
sure.
just order that for me by the time I get home?
Mhm.
Right? Or when you're in business, you can be like, what did we discuss in that last sales call? Like,
Yeah,
who was the
yeah.
person there? What was their title? Right? Just tell me what it was. Right? Or I need to fill up this form. I need to enter information about this user. Can we just like look at this PDF file and this invoice and this data, and can we just like fill up this form and get it done?
Mhm.
As opposed to me opening 10 tabs and reading a PDF file and like entering
Yeah,
data,
yeah.
right? Like all of these things that I do, it kind of feels like your AI assistants and agents ought to be able to do it, but for some
Sure.
reason they're not able to do it,
Yeah.
right? And what is the reason that they're not able to do it? And it turns out that there's two core reasons. The first is the core of everything that we've done at Hasura so far, which is that accessing data in various places is hard.
Mhm.
Having a consistent API to talk to them is hard. Having authorized access to it is very hard, right? Like, who's supposed to access what data and be able to read and write what data? Like, this is challenging. Even if you have APIs on all of this data, all the APIs are different. Expecting an AI to understand tens of thousands of API endpoints that are all like not documented or documented to varying degrees or outdated or use different kinds of API design styles, and something is GraphQL and something is REST, it's not realistic,
Sure.
right? You can't feed in that much complexity into an AI assistant and expect it to work. Because think of it like a human being, right? If I asked you, hey, can you go and like across 1,000 API endpoints that you have, figure this out for me and do it, you
Sure. Yeah.
probably won't be able to get it right for a long time, right? It'll
Yeah.
take you a lot of time and talking to people to get it right. So the first is kind of just making that data access more unified, secure, accessible. But the second piece um, on is, and I think we're going to see this all of this year in the next 18 months, is what we call kind of planning and plan following.
Mm.
One of the
Okay.
biggest challenges in AI is that when you're kind of doing some task with an AI assistant or an AI agent, right? Um, you'll notice that there's a goal drift. At some point of time in your conversation, the AI actually is not like, you guys are not talking about the same thing anymore.
Yeah.
Like, you're telling the AI to do something and it's forgotten because there's so much data in that context that you fed it, that it forgot like the original task you had, or it starts missing out like the rules that you set up. You like do these five things and it forget the third thing,
Sure.
right? You ask it to do something over like, hey, do this for 10 pieces of data, it'll do it only for two. It'll forget like eight, right? You start noticing that that interaction with data is not trustworthy. You can't actually trust it. It sort of does it and it sort of doesn't. It doesn't follow the plan that you thought it created or that you manually fed it well, right? And I think that piece on making sure that the AI system has a plan on interacting with your data, is able to execute the plan accurately. You can actually analyze the plan and see, hey, what did you do? How did you place this order? How did you fill up this data? Where did you even get this data from? Why do you think this is the right value? How did you calculate it? Right? You need that sophistication to come into your AI agent so that you can start trusting it to
Yeah.
make that data access happen. And that's kind of what we've been working on. We call this data access agent prompt QL. Just like you have a GraphQL API for your data, you now have like a prompt QL agent on your data. And so you can kind of go to prompt QL and ask it a question, and it'll first give you a plan. And it'll say, hey, this is what I'm planning to do. This is how I think we ought to do it. Um, and if you're good with this plan, let me go execute this plan. And it executes in this plan in a way that it could work on like, 1 MB of data or 5 GB of data. It could work on one document or 10,000 documents in the same kind of trustworthy way. And you can always like talk about the plan. You can be like, I don't like this plan. This plan is giving me inaccurate results. Fix it. This plan is, explain to me this plan. What data did you access? Audit it for me, right? And I think like that is what we've realized is kind of a massive unlock when it kind of comes to data access for AI. I said a lot of things, but does that make sense?
Yes, no, it does. It does. Like, I think, my whole take on AI is pretty simple, right? It's here to augment what a human is capable of doing. It's not
Mhm.
replacing. It's not even to an extent automating. It's
Yep,
augmenting the
it's augmenting. Exactly.
the capabilities of a person. And if that means that, hey, like we don't have the skills in house to build like the really good GraphQL queries or even like
Correct.
the really good queries in general to get access to this data, like we can have AI help us in that process by putting together a mechanism to get that data the way we want it, structured the way we want it, formatted the way we want
Correct.
it, what have you,
Correct.
and
Correct.
it's not a headache. So it allows us
Right.
as developers to focus on business logic or UI or some other area of our applications without having
Yep.
to get super deep into the weeds with data processing.
Correct. Correct. And also without, I think like product development is going to be so interesting when you have AI in the mix, right? Because as a developer, if you were building an AI agent for me, you don't have to think about all of those user stories that you have to write business logic for. It's
Yeah.
almost like you as a developer say, wait, hold on. If I give secure access to data to Tanmai, Tanmay can just use his AI to do whatever business logic he does on the fly.
Yep.
Why should I show him the um, average number of transactions that he's had over the last week grouped by interview? I mean, I
Yes.
don't, and give him 10 filters on this, right? Like, I don't need to clutter up my UI to do this, right? I can just tell him that, I have all of your transaction stuff. Just tell me what you want. And then Tanmay just writes his natural language thing or talks to it or sees like a thing that just does that on the fly, right? So it's like all of us have our own agents. And if we have our own agents, why preempt and hard code business logic? A
Yes.
certain kind of business logic. This producty business logic. You still have to have core business logic, the transaction itself, the ledger update, right? But
Mhm.
but you don't need this layer of other business logic that we've been kind of unnecessarily building, right?
Yeah.
Now it's just let me do it myself, right? Because it's cheap and it's customized to me.
I mean, it makes a ton of sense. Like I don't understand, you know, I could be convinced to use it. I don't know if I could be convinced not to use it. Like, sure,
Right,
I mean, not it's not one of those things where I'm just like everybody needs to go and get Hasura today. I don't think that like it depends on what you're
right,
trying to
right.
accomplish, right? However, if you see a need for
Yep,
this sort of functionality and you don't have the skills in house to do it,
yep,
right? Like, I mean, it's one of
yep,
those things where we see this time and time again where if you see something that's out in the market that's doing exactly what you want, why would you build it yourself?
correct,
Because I
correct,
mean, I
right?
can be the first one to say like everyone has this story of like they worked at a tech company and they basically built Kubernetes before Kubernetes came
Right,
out, right? Everybody has
exactly.
this story. It's like, oh, we needed to be
Yep,
able to, manage different machines and different applications that
yep,
are running at the same time and have service discovery and all these things. And then Kubernetes comes out. It's like, oh, we already wrote that. Like, but why would we like
yep,
anyway? So I see tons of value in this space, especially with this area of enriching it with AI, not like,
yep,
and I mean that in the most healthy way because I think a lot we talked about
correct,
this before we got started, right? Like there's a lot of put AI on in my SaaS or put AI in my business when it's probably not super beneficial to the business and for the customers of that business, right? To just
right,
AIify
right,
everything.
right. And I think like it's also kind of like exactly to your point. Like I think it's also going to be fascinating when a lot of these tools that exist that where you kind of start off with like uh, it's already built. Why should I build it myself?
Mhm.
And then when you kind of start to layer on top of that, which is that suddenly when you don't build it yourself, you start to, and this is what we've noticed as a business, um, and what most folks notice is that you kind of go from the technical problem to the organizational problem, right? Where you realize that it's not like before GitHub existed, we didn't know how to host a Git repo on like
Mhm.
a VPS or a droplet and just have shared access to it, right? Like
Yep.
it's very simple. You just set up like a Git repo on a on a DigitalOcean droplet or a VPS or something. Everybody has SSH keys into it, and you can just do git pull push and have a centralized repo as well. It's not not complicated, right? So why build it yourself? Let me just get a GitHub that works. But then
Yeah.
suddenly, when you have that building block, you realize, wait, hold up, there's a whole organizational problem around collaboration
Hmm.
with issues and pull requests that we can start to solve once people take this tool for granted.
Yes.
So once you take a high quality, secure API or like agent on your data, right? Or API for products for granted, you unlock like a set of organizational problems that are like far more valuable, right? Because now you
Yes.
start thinking
Yes.
about like, what's the right database to use? Right? Like, how should we like migrate data from this place to another? That's the real problem to think about. What's the right product to build? What's the right stakeholder to go to? What new data should we bring into the system? Right? You start thinking about like higher order things, which is kind of when it becomes like really exciting from like a like founder and as a business builder, right? Because you go from like suddenly you take this building block that people were kind of thinking about DIY versus like buy, and if the buy is default, then a whole bunch of cool stuff starts to happen on top of that, right? Which is interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we could keep going this conversation because I think that, you know, I think that there are certain areas of tech that AI immediately like gravitates towards as, hey, AI can help with this problem. Like in especially when we're talking about collecting insights from data, gather aggregating data in interesting ways. Like humans are never going to be good at processing like large amounts of data and quantifying it into
Yep,
something valuable. Like we're never going to be
yep,
able to do it because it's not how our brain was wired. But
yep.
computers are very good with data. Like you give it the right instructions and it does exactly what it wants. Like
Exactly.
and as we
And
wrap
humans
up,
are good with the
good.
plan, right?
Good.
They're good with the plan. They have a plan. They're like, this is what I want to do with the data.
Yeah.
I don't want to actually go and sift through every byte and do data entry
Yeah.
or classification or aggregation. I don't want to do all this, but I have a plan. I have a creative idea of what I want to do with the data. Go make it happen.
Yeah. No, I agree with all of that. And as we wrap up, I think one of the things that we talked a lot about like the current state of AI and how data comes into play. And we talked about like your upbringing in tech and all these sort of things. And I would love to kind of, as a closing, I'd love to get your thoughts on, you know, up until this point, Donmei, like you've done like a lot in this space. Where do you think this space is going? Like, and when you think about the things that you've done, like what do you think about as well?
I think I think when I think about like where the space is going, I I think there's a possibility of a massive disruption and reallocation of like where we spend our time and the things that we build. Um, I think that's kind of what I'm most excited about, which is increasing the number of people who can build systems, whether it's businesses or products that solve problems, and for developers and engineers to kind of start reallocating their time to solving kind of more product problems, more business problems,
Hmm.
as opposed to kind of this microservices infrastructure mess that we've been trying to do for the last 10 to 15 years,
Sure.
right? And I'm excited about that intellectual capital kind of reallocating more towards product and business, which is kind of fundamentally what AI is going to make happen. Um, I think that's what I'm kind of most excited about. That's where I think like that's where we've always been going, and I feel like AI is just going to make it happen much faster.
Yeah.
Going to leapfrog a bunch of like things that we were thinking about. Um, I'm when I think about all the work that we've been doing and like the work that's ahead of us, um, I'm super excited to help play a part in helping set up a piece of this infrastructure that allows for this, that allows for like unleashing this kind of ability to create and build. Uh, that has always been the most exciting to me. I feel like that's the most valuable work any of us can do, which is um, make people more productive, right? That's people know what's best for them. We just give them the tools and make them more productive to do what's best for them. That to me is always exciting, and it's great that we get to play a part in helping build that infra.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're doing something that I don't want to say it's like very advantageous. It's at the right time.
Yep.
Like, because, I think we hear about this all the time with AI. Like, this is the beginning. It's going to like, and like we're seeing this exponential growth of adoption, of usage interest, customers trying to do it, people trying to do it. And like the example that you were giving with your father, like anybody, like, you can talk, like, I can't imagine very many people don't know what ChatGPT is, or at least have heard of
Yeah.
ChatGPT, right?
Yeah.
So it's in the topical mind of almost everybody that has access to the news or access to the internet. Um,
Yep. Yep.
which is
And it's
which
not even
is
begun,
yeah, exactly.
right?
It's which
Like
is which is
it's not even
crazy.
like we know. I'm sure you know, and I know so many of engineers don't who don't yet know how to use AI productively for writing code, for example. The simplest use case,
Oh, sure.
right? The use
Like,
case that it's amazing at, it's still hard, right? It's still hard
oh
because you have to
yeah.
learn how to use it to write code, and even that hasn't happened. Like, yeah, people have no idea how amazing and how much change there's going to be with AI once they really learn how to use it, right?
Yes.
Which is going to be the next 5 years. That's going to be insane.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even thinking 5 years, thinking like 18 months. Like in 18 months, like what's the thing? Like we're gonna be on GPT 16 or whatever, and we're gonna have Sonnet 45, and it's just gonna do nonsense, like absolute nonsense. Like and no it and I'm
Fun
looking
times.
forward to it. So this conversation has been
Same.
great. For folks that might not be aware of the work that Tanmai and the folks over at Hasura are doing, I highly recommend. Like, you can find, him on social media, on Twitter, for instance, or X. So the best, easiest way is so Tanmaigo. That's his handle. You can also go to hasura.io, and there'll be links in the show notes to some of those places where you can find. And just as an aside, very impressive list of customers. Like, very, very impressive list of customers. Like, I looked when did a little bit of research. I looked and I was like, oh, okay. Like, I mean, I would just say like NASA. You see NASA and you're like, all right, let's go. Because I think that's like the
Nice.
ultimate flex. Like, my stuff is used to put people in space, right? Which I
Yeah,
think
and 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 a bunch of private space and electric companies that we can't put logos of,
oh,
but
sure,
it's great.
sure,
It's
sure.
good to be,
Yeah.
yeah. So
But
it's nice. It's great to be a part of all of the change that's happening.
yeah, no, I mean, and I'm looking forward to seeing, the next thing that you folks are doing, and I highly recommend folks that if you have interest in this space, definitely take a look at Hasura IO. As we sign off, do you have any parting words before we end the show?
No, thanks so much for having me, folks. If you aren't using AI yet, like the time is now. Get
Yeah,
into it. That's the only parting word that I have.
yeah,
It can do things that you don't think it can do yet. Just invest time in it. It's
yeah.
like the
You
biggest
know,
the biggest hump.
absolutely worst case, use it to do the things you don't want to do. That's
Exactly.
what I just tell people. Like, how many times have you like had to like build an app and you had to do all that stupid stuff that you don't want to do? Just have AI do it.
Exactly.
So,
Yep. Yep.
so this
Like
conver
macros, like X editing macros. It's amazing.
exactly. So so again, thank you for hanging out with me today, Tom. This has been great. And for the folks that were listening live and the folks that are listening in the future, I hope you have a great rest of your day. This has been Isaac Levin from Coffee and Open Source, and take care.